Campbell.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, your task in the coming weeks is to examine and make recommendations about the procurement and distribution of healthcare equipment and supplies, so that in any future crisis we are better prepared and better protected. To do that, you will embark upon a high-level consideration of plans, structures, communications, contracts and supply and distribution chains. So packed is your schedule in this module that for the first time you will not hear direct evidence from the bereaved or others impacted by delayed or inadequate PPE and medical supplies. But as you navigate the evidence from the top of the procurement decision-making models, you will, I know, bear in mind that mistakes and missed opportunities and the allegations of profiteering so powerfully addressed by Mr. Weatherby before the break had real-world consequences. Those consequences were felt at the time by frontline staff and their patients on hospital wards, in care homes and in their own homes, and they continue to have consequences, measured now by the ongoing impact on public confidence in the top echelons of government. It is hoped that the evidence you will consider in this module will enable you to make strong recommendations to minimise, so far as is possible, frontline consequences in any future pandemic or health crisis. But it is also to be hoped that those witnesses from whom you will hear will carefully consider the evidence that they give against the need for this public inquiry to go some way to restoring public confidence. My lady, real-world consequences. Witnesses, including representatives of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved, from whom you have heard in earlier modules and will hear from in future modules, have provided powerful evidence of impact. In our written opening, we remind you of the experiences of Bridget Halligan, the mother of Agnes McCusker, of Basil Elliott, the brother of Anne Elliott, who at separate times and in separate locations were two of the many people in Northern Ireland who died having contracted COVID in the care homes in which they lived. Their respective families and many others raised repeated concerns about the availability and inadequate use of PPE, which they believe cost their loved ones their lives. Michael Mallon, a father of four, was admitted to Craigavon Hospital for a non-COVID related reason in February 2021. He requested a clean, fluid-resistant surgical mask, only to be told that they were only changed every 3 days. He contracted COVID whilst in hospital and died isolated from his family. Seamus Anderson, who died in July 2021 in Altnagelvin Hospital. His wife Geraldine had asked if he could be placed on an ECMO machine, which she understood would have assisted him, only to be informed that there were none available. Understandably, Geraldine is concerned that a shortage of potentially life-saving equipment cost her husband his life. And my lady, we anticipate you will find support for all of these concerns and more in the evidence that you will hear and read in this module. We have an ageing hospital and care estate with often no mechanical ventilation, reliant entirely on natural ventilation. And you will hear from the Royal College of Nursing that our frontline nurses repeatedly raise concerns about the lack of access to PPE and FFP3 masks in that environment. Evidence from trusts reveal that frequent changes to PPE guidance, with the potential for multiple versions of guidance in circulation at any given time, led to staff confusion. That confusion, when combined with stocks on wards visibly running lower hour by hour, meant that the healthcare environment was frightening for staff and for patients. You will learn that some PPE was received by trusts without EU certification, leading to concerns about the protection it offered. Some goggles were non-compliant with guidance, not fully enclosing the eye area. Aprons were not compatible with PPE dispensers. Perforated edges poorly manufactured, ripping from one apron to the next, making them unusable. Some too short to adequately protect uniforms. And, my lady, you will hear of the recurring impact of the availability of types of FFP3 masks, which frequently changed with little or no notice. With each new mask introduced, there was an inevitable consequence on fit testing, with staff having to attend on multiple occasions due to changes in mask availability. My lady, when just 1% of staff in one trust had been incorrectly fit tested for the available mask, This affected over 1,300 frontline staff in the pandemic. Problems that in non-pandemic times would perhaps be surmountable take on much greater impact when staff and patients are at extreme risk, are frightened, are exhausted and are isolated. So what went wrong? It is fair to observe that BSO PALs may not warrant the same level of criticism or concern as their counterparts in Westminster. It is clear that efforts were made to increase stockpiles as a matter of urgency, even though emergency planning for stockpiles did not ordinarily fall within BSO PAL's remit. That was a responsibility owned by the DHSC. As it happened, tripling the peacetime PPE stock holding from 4 weeks to 12 weeks in late January 2020 proved wholly inadequate, equating to just 1 week's supply in pandemic terms. Why did BSO PALs have to take over stockpiling from the DHSC? What were BSO PALs told to prepare for as a worst-case scenario? And what lessons have been learned? How adequate are plans for the future? These are questions that we would like publicly answered. We recognise that the workload of BSO PALs became unprecedented, with overall demand rising by 429% at a time of intense global demand. The evidence you will hear presents a very concerning picture about preparedness for that level of demand, both at a devolved and UK level. But before turning to that, a word on how stock, as was available, was to be distributed domestically in Northern Ireland. You have heard many witnesses over the course of this inquiry stressing the benefits of our integrated health and social care system. You also know, indeed, I addressed you on it at a recent preliminary hearing, that within our care sector, 90% of care homes are privately owned, some under the umbrella of large providers, some individual family-run care homes. And yet, in an environment in which even BSO PALs or the UK government were struggling to get its place in the market, the Department of Health guidance issued in March 2020 outlined that independent care providers were to source their own PPE and that trusts should only provide PPE to them when suspected or confirmed COVID cases arose. The result was that throughout March 2020, independent care homes received only a small amount of PPE when already in crisis, and the considerable shortage in that sector were not addressed, much less were the vulnerability of its residents. The position for domiciliary care is still worse. In an email from the CEO of the Independent Health and IHCP, written on the 23rd of March 2020, fear and frustration is encapsulated about the lack of immediate answers to the availability of PPE in the domiciliary sector. The advice about stay at home and socially distance, she writes, does not apply to staff in our sector who continue to work without PPE. We have 23,000 people every week receiving domiciliary care. Social distancing is impossible, and this is a high-risk area for transfer, yet no one is taking this seriously. She details a call with the Director of Mental Health, Disability and Older People in the Department of Health, in which she was told that, quote, medical advice is that domiciliary care workers don't need masks, don't need to socially distance, and just need to wash their hands frequently. Despite her efforts, she could not get the Department of Health to see the problems with this paradox of information to care workers, and she notes that she gave up her efforts after an hour. It may be, my lady, that the Department of Health position in relation to medical advice and the distribution of PPE to the independent sector changed within a matter of weeks, at least for care homes. But those were critical weeks, and the consequences we know for those who lived in care homes and for families who now grieve them were catastrophic. And so we anticipate that we will ask you to consider a recommendation that ensures that never again can the department be so ill prepared or delegate its responsibility to the independent sector. My lady, you know well that those are not the only concerns of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved. While procurement from Belfast has not been subject to the same accusations of profiteering or cronyism as procurement from London, that does not to say that what was happening in London did not impact in Belfast. nor is it to say that there are not domestic improvements that can be identified through strengthening supply chains, ensuring transparency, leaving a clear audit trail of transactions, and identifying conflict of interest and ensuring data storage. We are particularly concerned about an apparent complete loss of all emails and messages emanating from the Northern Ireland Bureau representative in China, precluding any examination of their content. And we anticipate that by the end of this module, you will have good reason to make strong recommendations in each of those areas. My lady, before I conclude, a word about coordination with the devolved administrations. In other modules, we have addressed you about the lost month of February, when time slipped through fingers like sand through an hourglass. But does this module also expose that there was a lost month of March? Andy Wood, the lead for PPE buy-sell, from whom you will hear this week, sent an email on the 22nd of March 2020 with a 10-point list of basic requirements if he was to, as he put it, stand a chance of success. It's a fair observation that that list tells a tale of starting from scratch. He needs technical assurance, international logistics, new supplier hunters, governance, data, logistics, warehousing. 22nd of March 2020, my lady, the day before lockdown, starting from scratch. It might be thought unsurprising against that background that 2 months later, in May 2020, the devolved administrations were individually and collectively raising concerns about an absence of a four nations approach to procurement and about a lack of transparency about procurement decisions taken by the DHSC, apparently on behalf of 4 UK nations. My lady, it would be a full 10 months after that before the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock's proposed UK-wide protocol to support collaborations on the sourcing and supply of PPE would be issued for consideration by the devolved administrations in May 2021. Too little, quite possibly. Too late, most definitely. My lady, I end with a reminder that the cost of failings that you will consider in this module is not only to be identified at the bottom of a bank balance or on a balance sheet. The Northern Ireland COVID bereaved continue to pay an enormous price through their grief, which is immeasurable and which must not be repeated. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Campbell. Ms Parsons.
My lady, this is the opening statement on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru. The importance of this module for this group cannot be overstated. Right across Wales, whether in hospitals, care homes, hospices, members witnessed first-hand shortages in PPE and equipment. More tragically, they experienced those shortages first-hand. And so they asked themselves, would more and better PPE have saved the lives of their loved ones? Would more and better access to CPAP, oxygen, ventilators have made the difference? Of course, questions like this on an individual level are not the matter for the inquiry. But the collective testimony of this group, its collective voice, speaks to the existence of sustained and systemic problems in Wales. Mark Drakeford, First Minister, Vaughan Gething, Minister for Health and Social Services, amongst others in the Welsh Government, have prepared statements for this module. They claim that Wales, on a national level, never ran out of PPE. They claim that Wales was never short of ventilators. Indeed, the picture today, presented in opening, was rather rosy. Teething problems, yes, but a well-established, equitable way of distribution was established in Wales in due course, characterised by close collaboration at all levels of government. My lady, it is a rosy picture that the members of the group will not recognise. Their questions remain. Why did they witness such appalling shortages in PPE? Not just in wave 1, but in later waves. Why did they experience delays in accessing vital equipment and supplies? Against that main point, that backdrop, I flag some specific concerns. First and foremost, nosocomial infections. As the pandemic went on, families in Wales felt it was a grim inevitability that if admitted to hospital during the pandemic, their loved one would catch COVID. Their fears were well-founded. Data from Public Health Wales showed that as of the 24th of February 2021, of patients in Welsh hospitals testing positive for COVID, 53% caught it in hospital. The issue, as ever, is best expressed by the words of the group's members. Anna Louise Marsh-Rees, co-leader of the group. Her father caught COVID in hospital in October 2020, as did 21 others on his ward, of which 12, including her father, sadly passed away. Her father had to wait 40 minutes for a high-flow oxygen machine. The hospital confirmed it was being used elsewhere. Anne-Marie Richards, her husband caught COVID in hospital in December 2020, as did 25 other patients and 25 staff members. Tragically, he never recovered. Hywel Dda Health Board told Mrs. Richards, rather opaquely, that, I quote, exposure to multiple hospital environments would have made Mr. Richards more vulnerable to hospital-acquired infections, end quote. Sam Smith-Higgins, the other co-leader of the group, her father caught COVID in hospital in January 2021. He was not permitted access to a HEPA filter, despite such filters being low cost and portable, and nor was he ever offered a mask. He tragically passed away 3 weeks after admission. And finally, Sylvia. She appeared in the impact video in Module 3, my lady. She lost her father after he caught COVID in a community hospital in April 2020. She saw undertakers there in full hazmat suits. Healthcare workers, reliant on supplies from the local health board, had nothing. The group's members feel a real sense of betrayal. They did everything in their power to keep their loved ones safe. They followed the government guidelines stringently. Yet they could not keep their loved ones safe in hospital. And the members of the group want to know, why was the risk of contracting COVID in hospital so high? Many of them strongly believe that poor prevention and infection control, including lack of appropriate PPE, lack of access to oxygen and ventilators, and poor ventilation, led to the death of their loved ones. Second point, care homes. My lady, care homes in Wales, particularly in the early stages, were completely overlooked. There were problems with supply of PPE. There were problems with supply of appropriate PPE. There were problems with guidance, targeted as it was to a hospital setting. On the 19th of March 2020, as we heard this morning, the Welsh Government announced that shared services had expanded its reach to the social care sector. But by May 2020, only 2/3 of care homes were supplied by shared services, the remainder presumably having to make their own arrangements. And as the Welsh Local Government Association observed, problems in supplies were noted in care homes at points throughout the pandemic. As for the type of PPE supplied, we see records of surgical masks, aprons, gloves, and eye protection. No sign of FFP3 masks, my lady, so essential in preventing aerosol transmission. Again, the issue is best expressed in the words of one of the group's members, Catherine Griffiths. Her father contracted COVID in his care home in Aberystwyth. She describes the last time she saw him. On the 16th of November 2020, I was invited to the care home to say goodbye to Dad. I wanted to go in, sit by his side, and hold and comfort Dad. My brother urged me not to. The level of PPE in the home was abysmal. We could see the nurse wearing just an apron and a flimsy surgical mask. I was forced to say goodbye to my father while standing in the icy rain outside his window. The group is extremely concerned that COVID was left to run rampant through care homes in Wales, leading to an unacceptable loss of life. And they want to know, why was the use of PPE in care homes so patchy? Why were supplies of PPE and appropriate PPE so lacking? my third and final point, infection prevention and control, IPC guidance on FFP3 masks. Wales went into the pandemic with 90% of its FFP3 masks out of date. A Four Nations meeting on the 12th of March 2020, dealing with shortages of FFP3 masks across the nations, flagged that Wales was in particular difficulty. It had just 10,000 of them. To put that in some context, that's just 10% of Northern Ireland stock, despite Wales having double the population. From March the 13th, one day later, IPC guidance was announced that FFP3 masks were to be used only in intensive care units and aerosol-generating procedures. Professor Catherine Noakes, from whom you heard in an earlier module, suggests that the reluctance to properly acknowledge airborne transmission was in part because, and I quote, the significant resource and operational implications of doing so. Was it the case that a shortage of supply improperly dictated the terms of the IPC guidance? It was known that the virus was spread by aerosol transmission from the early stages of the pandemic. Suffice to quote Professor Van Tam, who said in January 2020 that, and I quote, historical HSE position is that maximum RPE is required. The group want to know, why was this ignored? Why did IPC guidance not reflect this? The impact of IPC guidance was experienced directly by some of the group's members. Sian Haig, her husband Alan, was an emergency technician for the Welsh Ambulance Service in Carmarthenshire. He caught COVID by attending the home of a COVID patient. He was wearing a surgical mask, apron and gloves. His colleague had an FFP3 mask and a visor as she was administering treatment. Both acted in accordance with IPC guidance. Sadly, Mr. Haig's level of PPE was not sufficient to protect him. He passed away, and his inquest concluded the cause of death was industrial accident due to not having an FFP3 mask. And so briefly to conclude, my lady, as we've heard, the inquiry will hear evidence about the process of procurement, supply chains, VIP lanes, and so on. But at the end of the day, of course, procurement was ultimately about people. The main purpose of procurement was to save lives. For the members of the group, procurement didn't save lives. And they, of course, want to know why. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Parsons. Ms Mitchell.
I'm instructed by our Anwar company on behalf of the Scottish Government.
I'm not sure it's working. Try again.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah. I am instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. Throughout this inquiry, the bereaved have discovered a great many things that they suspected were indeed true. The country was not ready for a pandemic. Governments fell into panic and chaos. Systems and structures that should work as checks and balances on power were swept aside for a small group making unchecked and unaccountable decisions. And so it is, we find that the same problems affected the procurement of PPE. From the material available so far, it appears that this chaos spread to procurement of the vital equipment that people of our four nations needed so desperately to keep us safe. Market forces dictated that timescales were shortened, demand increased, suppliers were able to choose who to sell to and for how much. The Scottish COVID bereaved asked, where was the accountability for spending public money? The processes and procedures that ought to have been undertaken, the unglamorous, if necessary, paperwork was not done. The bereaved consider that without this recording of information, there was no set criteria in the awarding of contracts, and this led to a number of, with the use of significant understatement, very poor business decisions. These had direct impact on the availability of life-saving equipment and items in our hospitals, care homes and communities. There has, of course, been great focus on the high priority or VIP lane. The bereaved are anxious to know who thought this to be a good idea. What, if any, consideration was given to prioritising pre-existing companies who had track records in meeting contracts and deadlines? Why was it thought that the criteria of knowing people was somehow the best defining factor of what would get us the best PPE at the lowest prices? The disclosure made to core participants has brought to light research showing that on occasion the high priority lane only provided the most expensive average price per unit for 3 categories: gloves, aprons and body bags. It was known that the companies involved with the high priority lanes were mostly dealing with intermediaries, many of whom were sourcing from the same factories in China that the government was already in contact with. It was known that this route was potentially disruptive rather than additive to the process of getting PPE. In addition, as aforementioned, the audit trails, which should have been at the very heart of government procurement, were not working. They were inconsistent and limited. This is clearly not acceptable. The Scottish COVID bereaved consider that for some, the pandemic was seen as an opportunity to defraud and make obscene profit. The bereaved wish to know whether profit was put before people. They wish to know what can be done when the next pandemic comes to ensure that the strict guidance in place to allow for proper procurement processes will be there. It's only by doing this that the people of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom can be sure that the interests of we, the people, are being placed before profit. These are the submissions of the Scottish COVID bereaved.
Thank you very much indeed, Mitchell. I'm very grateful. Who's next? Mr. Thomas.
Lady.
Are you switched on?
Milady, can you hear me?
Yes, but are you switched on, Mr. Thomas?
I am.
Sure. Oh, you are now. Yeah.
I am. The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Gandhi. Milady, as we commence Module 5 of this inquiry, we're presented with an opportunity to rigorously examine the procurement process during the COVID pandemic. We say that this module is crucial because it focuses on assessing whether these processes adequately consider and address the needs of the NHS diverse workforce and the communities they serve. There are also some key questions for the inquiry to explore on the involvement and representation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in leadership roles and decision-making in the procurement processes. We urge you and your team to scrutinise how measures implemented during the pandemic ensured that the procurement practices and processes were not only efficient but also equitable. Our discussion today is particularly centred on how understanding the impact of these practices and processes on Black, Asian and minority ethnic healthcare and social care workers who were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Milady, we've said it before and it does bear repeating. The first 10 doctors to die and lose their lives to the virus were from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. That these deaths were of Black, Asian and minority ethnic doctors was not a coincidence. These tragic losses, representing not just colleagues but also friends and family, underscore the dire consequences of structural and systemic inequalities deeply rooted in our society. FEMHO's members, who stand at the intersection of race and healthcare, live the reality of structural and systemic inequalities each and every day of the pandemic. They continue to do so and will continue to do so until real action is taken to ensure that society is equal, just and fair. Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff now make up almost a quarter of the workforce overall, 24.2%. More than 2/5, 42% of doctors, dentists and consultants, and almost a third, 29.2%, of nurses, midwives and health visitors. And yet, representation at board level is only 13.2%. The figure for very senior managers is lagging at about 10.3%. This gross underrepresentation in decision-making, including procurement, has contributed to the disproportionate impact experienced by FEMHO's members. You see, milady, Module 5 provides a crucial opportunity to prevent future injustices and ensure that these disparities and the equality duties designed specifically to minimise their impact and promote equality are never again forgotten or ignored within procurement processes and decision-making. We submit that the disproportionate impact of the pandemic, and in particular its impact on ethnic minority health and social care workers, should never be sidelined or an afterthought. And while we note that these issues were not addressed in Council to the inquiry's opening statement, we trust that the inquiry will address these issues as we proceed in Module 5. FEMHO considers that Module 5 examines how government procurement processes and procedures and decision-making differentially affected ethnic minority communities, and there are a number of things that we'd ask you to look at. Firstly, we acknowledge this inquiry's commitment to exploring these disparities, but we urge you, milady, to ensure that these important topics are kept at the forefront of everything the inquiry does, including now within your assessment of procurement processes. So what are the essential questions? Milady, there are some important questions for your consideration. When you examine procurement strategies implemented during the pandemic, we invite you to ask the following. How were these strategies designed to reflect the needs of the NHS's diverse workforce? Were considerations of diversity integral to the procurement process from the outset? Were the procurement strategies in place sufficiently robust to address the urgent needs of all healthcare workers, particularly those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds who faced disproportionate risks? What evidence was gathered to show that the measures taken during the procurement processes were effective in preventing losses of healthcare workers, especially amongst ethnic minorities? Where did these measures fall short and why? Then turning to the long-term consequences of the procurement decisions in the light of the acknowledged structural inequalities, the following questions may be relevant. How did the decisions made during the pandemic affect long-term resilience and equity within the NHS? What steps are now required to rectify these disparities? And how did the NHS and the government bodies ensure that the compliance with the public sector equality duty during the procurement processes, if at all? And were any compliance measures effectively monitored and enforced? So, milady, as ever, FEMHO is here to assist you and the inquiry in ensuring that the mistakes of the pandemic are not repeated and that the reforms we pursue are bold, inclusive and lasting. FEMHO wishes to assist you in this with solutions. I've always said this, we want to be solutions orientated. So FEMHO's of the view that structural inequalities impacted upon the procurement decisions, the availability of healthcare equipment and supplies during the pandemic, leading to significant shortages of the very equipment that health and social care workers and their patients desperately needed. There is no doubt that PPE was in short supply, we've heard that. And even when it was available, it was not suitable or effective for some Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. Much of the typical PPE procured in the UK has been designed and manufactured based on the average facial measurements of a white man. We've heard that evidence already. And this is just simply unacceptable in today's society. Powered air purifying respirator hoods, which were not required to be close-fitting, was not supplied. And even if it appears that the cost differential between this and other PPE was not significant, there was also too few ventilators and not enough oxygen. So let me summarise by just saying this and finishing by saying this. In the circumstances of the pandemic, this was all life-saving equipment which, if not available, quite obviously led to avoidable deaths. The circumstances which health and social care workers faced in the workplace during the pandemic was patently unsafe for all, both physically and psychologically. Minority ethnic healthcare workers were more likely to work in hazardous conditions without adequate RPE or PPE than white counterparts. Not only this, they were the least empowered to speak up about it, and you've heard evidence about that in previous modules. So FEMHO submits that the dire circumstances that they faced and were labouring under, and which their patients and service users were also expected to endure, can be traced back to a highly flawed procurement process and decision-making. Never mind having regard to due regard, these processes and decision-making appear to have taken no account at all of the public sector equality duty. No account appears at all to have been taken about the disparate impact, which was obvious, and you've heard evidence about that in previous modules. We also contend that the structural inequalities shape the availability and indeed access to the lateral flow tests and the PCR tests. And as we've previously stated, this inquiry has the profound responsibility to confront what we describe as uncomfortable truths of systemic inequality and structural racism. These are not peripheral issues to the pandemic response. They are central failings that cost lives. So, Milady, we urge this inquiry to keep these issues at the forefront of its investigation into procurement. Let's ensure that the findings from this inquiry lead directly to substantial reforms, making our healthcare system a fair and safe place for every community it serves. Thank you, Milady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Milady. The opening statement on behalf of the British Medical Association is as follows. Poor procurement and distribution of vital healthcare equipment and supplies meant that healthcare staff had to care for their patients with scarce resources, inadequate equipment, and the ever-present danger of a potentially deadly virus, often without the protection they so desperately needed. This had a devastating and lasting impact on staff and patients alike, causing stress, anxiety, moral injury, infection, long-term disease, and sadly death. This statement covers the procurement, distribution, and the experience of the end user in relation to PPE, testing, ventilators, and oxygen. First, PPE. The quantity and quality of PPE supplies was woefully inadequate, with over 4 in 5 respondents to a BMA survey stating that they did not feel fully protected during the first wave. There were severe shortages of PPE across all healthcare settings, particularly in the early months. Healthcare staff were forced to go without PPE, reuse single-use items, and use handmade or self-bought items. One GP in Northern Ireland told the BMA, "We were sent 6 pairs of gloves and 6 aprons in an envelope approximately 3 weeks after the start of lockdown." Some inquiry witnesses have stated that the UK never ran out of PPE and that the problems were with the distribution rather than overall quantities. It will be important for the inquiry to fully explore both of these issues, and yet the bottom line remains that healthcare staff did not have access to the life-saving PPE they needed when they needed it. In some cases, PPE was defective and failed to meet safety requirements. Some of these faulty items reached frontline staff, with numerous reports of face mask straps breaking. Ultimately, billions of pounds worth of PPE arrived unfit for purpose and had to be destroyed. Many BMA members reported feeling pressured to work without adequate protection. They lived in constant fear for their own lives and the lives of their patients, colleagues, and loved ones. Many healthcare workers, including over 50 doctors, tragically died, and it cannot be emphasised enough that these deaths were not inevitable. Large numbers of staff developed long COVID, and they continue to experience the devastating personal and professional effects, with many unable to work or train, losing their careers and livelihoods, as well as their health. Adverse impacts were also disproportionately experienced by women, ethnic minority staff, and those with a disability or long-term health condition. There are many factors that contributed to these failings, but for present purposes, the BMA highlights just 3 of the main causes. First, pandemic planning for PPE was inadequate. The focus on pandemic influenza, rather than preparing for a wider range of threats, meant that the stockpiles were primarily comprised of fluid-resistant surgical masks rather than respiratory protective equipment, which protects from aerosol transmission. Alongside this, the UK's ability to supplement PPE stockpiles in times of crisis was compromised by a reliance on just-in-time contracts and a lack of domestic manufacturing capacity. Second, there was a failure to procure adequate and appropriate PPE as a direct result of flawed infection prevention and control guidance, which failed to recommend adequate protection against aerosol transmission despite long-standing scientific understanding of the level of protection required in these circumstances. This failure was influenced by the critical shortage of respiratory protective equipment in early 2020. Further, once the IPC cell recommended that respiratory protective equipment was not required for routine care of COVID-19 patients, it stubbornly refused to revise its position later in 2020 when there was increasingly strong evidence for aerosol transmission, and at a time when the easing of supply constraints would have made it possible to procure the necessary quantities of respiratory protection, but for the limitations imposed by the guidance. These mutually reinforcing influences, the initial shortages which led to flawed guidance, followed by the stubborn refusal to change the flawed guidance, worked together to leave staff unprotected throughout the pandemic. Third, the failure of government leaders to act quickly to secure adequate stocks of PPE, including the failure to participate in the joint EU procurement scheme, and processes that were characterised by delay, lack of transparency, and a lack of due diligence, notably in the use of the high priority lane. At a time when frontline staff had been risking their lives working in an under-resourced and unsafe system, BMA members felt particularly let down by reports of these failures and the significant amounts of money wasted. Staff safety was also affected by a lack of access to testing. The initial limited capacity to test at the scale needed, combined with shortages of tests themselves and the UK government making relatively little use of the pre-existing NHS laboratories, caused delays in identifying cases and likely meant that staff unwittingly transmitted COVID-19 to patients and colleagues. It also impacted staff capacity at this critical time due to self-isolation. Turning to ventilators, procurement processes for this equipment were inefficient and inadequate and resulted in the provision of ventilators that were unsafe, unsuitable, and unfamiliar to staff, which led to the need to transfer patients to different hospitals due to a lack of critical care capacity. Time and money were also wasted on new ventilator prototypes, which were never ultimately purchased, despite the fact that there were ventilator models that were already approved by the MHRA. All of this led to localised shortages of ventilators, especially in London during March 2020, in response to which anaesthesia machines, which are only designed to be used for a few hours at a time, were repurposed and used as substitutes for ventilators. The necessity of this measure highlights the critical gap in capacity at the height of the first wave. Such shortages also had significant impacts. They affected patient care, and they also exacerbated the atmosphere of stress and uncertainty for staff at an already incredibly challenging time. In respect of oxygen, the pandemic exposed significant vulnerabilities in the UK's medical oxygen supplies to hospital wards, which had never been subjected to the strain they were under during the peaks of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. The risk of a sudden loss of oxygen pressure within hospital oxygen delivery systems was a major concern, and to reduce the risk of this happening, delivery flows were maximised and staff were told to ration oxygen by reducing target oxygen saturation levels in patients, which contributed to stress and moral injury. One resident doctor in England told the BMA that it was mostly luck that our oxygen supplies did not fail. This highlights an important structural issue. Aged hospital estates are a key strain on oxygen levels, and it is crucial that hospital estates are upgraded to ensure they can deliver high-flow, piped oxygen when the next pandemic hits, so that this life-saving resource is readily accessible at the levels required when needed most. My lady, in conclusion, millions of pounds of public money were wasted through rushed and ill-thought-through procurement during the pandemic, including PPE that never reached healthcare staff and ventilators that never reached patients. Procurement and distribution of healthcare equipment are not just bureaucratic processes, they are a lifeline that provide critical protections and supplies to ensure the safety of those who work in the system and those that they care for. The failure to do this has impacted the physical and mental health of healthcare staff, and the lack of transparency, robustness and value for money has damaged their trust and confidence in the systems that should have protected them and their patients. Trust will not return easily, and the inquiry's recommendations in this module will be a vital part of the journey to rebuild it. The BMA respectfully requests that the inquiry focuses on issues and evidence that will, first, lead to better protection for healthcare staff, including through a reliable, diverse supply of PPE available to suit all staff and for a range of potential pathogens. Second, improve patient care and reduce staff moral injury through better supplies of key equipment, such as ventilators, and the ability of NHS estates to supply oxygen at scale in future emergencies. Third, reform procurement and outsourcing processes to ensure greater transparency, efficiency, and accountability. And finally, fourth, increase domestic manufacturing capacity for PPE and other key healthcare supplies. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Smith.
My lady, thank you for giving the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition the opportunity to speak today. I am Chris Smith, the Public Procurement Consultant and member of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, who, among many other procurement projects over 4 decades, procured PPE for the UK-funded Ebola treatment centres in Sierra Leone in 2014. We have submitted a 180-page plus Rule 9 response to the inquiry, which includes 8 lessons learned and recommendations for the inquiry to consider, and am invited to give evidence tomorrow, for which we are very grateful. One of our members, Transparency International, recently published a report, Behind the Masks, Corruption Red Flags in COVID-19 Public Procurement, which we have already shared with the inquiry. My lady, the UKHSA speaks truth to power, and we hope the work we are doing to support the inquiry will help to get power to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth may be, because by doing that, we are convinced valuable lessons will be learned and future lives saved. On the 20th of March 2020, Gavin Hayman of the Open Contracting Partnership, a member of UKHSA, published an article entitled Emergency Procurement for COVID-19 Buying Fast, Open and Smart, with a number of constructive and practical suggestions. The vaccine procurement is widely considered to have been a huge success story, a miracle, a lifesaver. In contrast, the public and media perception is that the PPE procurement wasn't open or smart, and the words profiteering, cronyism, incompetence, vested interests, secretive, corrupt, ineffective, hugely wasteful, and even cover-up are more likely to spring to mind in the public consciousness. Foremost in our minds in applying to become core participants was our collective belief that lives were unnecessarily put at risk and lost, and taxpayers' money wasted on a colossal scale because of the approach the UK took to the purchase of PPE. In the spectrum of items procured by government, from atomic bombs to zero-emission buses, we say that PPE should not be a difficult category to buy properly. We note the NHS was procuring large amounts of PPE before the pandemic for its day-to-day needs, and the PPE requirements, such as masks, aprons and gloves, were straightforward and not, unlike COVID-19, novel. Yes, during the pandemic, the prices may be high, and yes, the availability may be a severe constraint, but following standard best practice procurement principles and techniques, it should have been possible to avoid many of the problems that arose: incorrect supply, non-compliant packaging, numerous contractual disputes, and a massive write-off of taxpayers' money. It seems reasonable to assume that such problems impacted the availability of PPE in healthcare settings and care homes, with, in some cases, tragic consequences. We say that the government's outsourcing of PPE sourcing to British traders, who in some cases had no prior experience supplying PPE, or in some cases no prior existence, was a reckless strategy that should at least have been mitigated by payment conditional on pre-shipment inspection. This pre-shipment inspection never happened, and many of the quality problems were only discovered after the PPE arrived in the UK and the supplier paid in full. This approach increased the risk of shortages of usable PPE and posed a substantial fiscal risk which materialised. We say there is a continued lack of transparency concerning COVID contracts. The government failed and continues to fail to meet its transparency obligations by publishing copies of all PPE contracts in full. Supply Chain Coordination Limited has never published many PPE contracts worth billions of pounds, and most others issued by DHSC have only been partially published, a clear breach of Cabinet Office transparency policy. We have concluded that this is due to a toxic mix of bad record keeping, indifference, defensiveness of the organisations concerned. We also surmise that in some cases contracts don't even exist, which, if true, is worthy of further investigation by the inquiry. We would like to reiterate our serious concern that the procurement of some £10 billion worth of COVID-related services contracts, many also awarded without competition, remains out of scope for Module 5. Whilst we welcome the inclusion of procurement case studies, we are very concerned, like other CPs, that no suppliers of PPE have been asked to give evidence. We feel strongly that whilst the government side of procurement is important to scrutinise, in order to get to the bottom of what went wrong, the inquiry must have evidence in front of it from the supplier side, because, to put it frankly, we believe in many cases serious mistakes were made by government that may have led to incorrect supplies of PPE. For example, many government PPE contracts lacked proper technical specification, which increased the risk of an incorrect supply. High Court documents in the public domain for the PPE MedPro contract suggest this is a real possibility. The evidence from both parties in that case is conflicting and revealing, because the PPE supplier has given evidence, raising questions of government competence that we fear will not necessarily be discovered if the inquiry in its own investigation only relies on the government's account of how it responded to suppliers offering PPE. The decision appears inconsistent with the inquiry's approach to ventilator contracts, where suppliers have been asked to give evidence and to some extent provides the central government departments and ex-ministers and officials with an opportunity to mark their own homework. As core participants, we express serious concerns and dismay about the government's repeated delays in providing vital evidence to the inquiry, which was discussed during the second preliminary hearing. These delays must have impacted significantly the inquiry's ability to conduct a comprehensive investigation into procurement practices during the pandemic, undermining its effectiveness and the public's right to full accountability and transparency. This unacceptable situation is particularly concerning, considering that Prime Minister Keir Starmer said in July 2024, that the safety and security of the country must always be the first priority, and this government is committed to learning lessons from the inquiry and putting better measures in place to protect and prepare us for the impact of any future pandemic. We are concerned that the interests of central government departments in this case is their first priority, and we find their excuses unconvincing and concerning. We appreciate your ladyship's continued efforts to obtain all the requested evidence. The inquiry's findings and recommendations are crucial to ensure that lessons are learned and government departments implement safeguards to prevent the misuse of public funds and poor procurement that put lives at risk in future emergencies. We say that the government and the Department of Health and Social Care in particular must demonstrate commitment to transparency and accountability by fully cooperating with the inquiry without further delay. We call on the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to make sure this happens. The inquiry and the public, particularly the bereaved families, deserve a full and transparent account of decisions made during the pandemic. The VIP lane was created by politicians who went far beyond the call of duty to help and strayed into dangerous territory that in some cases introduced significant additional risks for the NHS, healthcare workers, patients and taxpayers that materialised. In opposition, the current government tabled several amendments to the draft procurement bill to outlaw VIP lanes. These amendments were rejected and have not been addressed by the current government in regulations or guidance, and the risk of some future government resorting to VIP lanes during some further crisis remains something we hope the inquiry will consider. However, we ask the government not to wait for your report and instead to develop and publish regulations or guidance prohibiting the use of VIP lanes. In opposition, the Labour Party committed to follow Ukraine's footsteps and publish an accessible dashboard of government contracts that is available to anyone as part of our Public Works pledge. The central digital platform is not sufficient, and we call on the Cabinet Office to establish citizen-friendly dashboards so that we can monitor public contracts, including emergency contracts, during any future crisis. We note the stark contrast between AstraZeneca, which sold its vaccine at cost, and British suppliers of PPE, who in some cases exploited the situation, took advantage of the government and NHS's vulnerable position, and profiteered at the taxpayers' expense, while in some cases also failing to deliver usable PPE. As a result, the NHS was not fully protected, nor was the loss of life minimised. Such behaviour was shameful, and those mainly British companies let the country down in its hour of need. And again, we question why only one PPE contract has been the subject of High Court action. Last week, the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, announced that the government was investigating, under new powers available to it in the Procurement Act, a number of suppliers involved in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower with a view to possible debarment from involvement in future public contracts. We call on the government not to wait for your report and to launch similar investigations into certain suppliers of PPE now. In conclusion, we pay tribute to the work of the Good Law Project, certain parts of the media, independent journalists, MPs and members of the House of Lords who worked tirelessly to hold the government accountable and expose many of the issues of concern about its approach to procuring PPE to the public and to the inquiry's scrutiny. Lives were without doubt lost due to very bad and reckless procurement decisions made by the government and unscrupulous and greedy suppliers, and we urge the inquiry to leave no stone unturned to help sure this never happens again. The families of the bereaved and the wider public deserve nothing less. The pandemic was unavoidable, but the sometimes chaotic and ineffective maladministration of the procurement of some PPE most certainly was. We are at your disposal for any clarification or any additional information that you or your team require. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Mitchell.
My Lady, this is the opening statement on behalf of the Scottish Government. I appear today along with Junior Counsel Michael Way, and we are instructed by Caroline Beattie and Callum McHugh of the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. During the pandemic, the environment in which procurement agencies found themselves operating was unprecedented, as around the globe nations rushed to secure the materials necessary to protect their citizens. This context is important in arriving at a proper understanding of the response to the challenges faced. In Scotland, however, remarkable outcomes were achieved. In large part, this was due to robust, tried and tested public procurement processes, networks and relationships that had existed prior to the pandemic. In these regards, Scotland began from a strong starting point. Yet that was not the only reason for the positive outcomes. The Scottish Government sought to develop new relationships and to innovate. In this opening statement, therefore, our themes are collaboration, relationships, innovation, and governance. These were the keystones of the approach adopted by the Scottish Government. Looking firstly at some key structures and processes, the Scottish Government Procurement and Property Directorate is responsible for developing and maintaining a framework of Scottish public procurement legislation and policy. A significant procurement reform programme, begun in 2006, had brought about a familiarity with policy and with legislation. This led to established connections with technical and clinical experts and with end users of products. Actual procurement and distribution of PPE and healthcare equipment is delegated to a Special Health Board, NSS. It has proven procedures in place for due diligence, pricing, quality control, distribution and supply. It has long-standing, trusted relationships with a diverse range of suppliers. Prior to the pandemic, Scotland owned a PPE stockpile, which was a vital part of the Scottish Government's initial response to the pandemic. Although supplies were stretched in the early months, at no point did Scotland run out of PPE. In April of 2020, the newly established Scottish Government PPE Directorate led on the publication of the PPE Action Plan. This aimed to ensure that the right PPE of the right quality gets to the people who need it at the right time. It set out the roles and responsibilities at a national level for procurement and distribution, as well as the governance arrangements within the Scottish Government. The PPE Strategy and Governance Board was responsible for overseeing the implementation of the action plan. During the pandemic, procurement of ICU equipment was undertaken by NSS in collaboration with the Scottish Government ICU Resilience and Support Group. This group provided central coordination and made key decisions on the distribution of equipment to NHS boards. The Scottish Government entirely recognises the need to engage and to work closely with partners across the UK. It did and it will continue to do this. However, given the expertise and the knowledge possessed by NSS of Scottish requirements, the Scottish Government is yet to be persuaded that the delegation of emergency procurement to a Four Nations body would bring about tangible improvements. Turning now to governance, transparency and accountability, the Scottish Government relied upon pre-existing policies, the legislative framework and robust due diligence checks to ensure good governance and transparency. The requirement to secure value for money was emphasised in policy notes. The normal rules about record keeping, guarding against conflict of interest continue to apply throughout the pandemic. The use of emergency provisions within existing legislation was necessary and contributed to the speed at which the Scottish Government and NSS could implement their response. A framework contract was awarded by the Scottish Government to Lareco, an existing and trusted supplier, to supply PPE to non-health or social care essential services, where they were struggling to access it. Lareco agreed to supply PPE at a cost basis, making the contract good value for money. In respect of any approach, bid or contact by the Scottish Procurement Property Directorate, there have been no suspicions, concerns or instances of fraud in relation to procurement or award of contracts before, during or after the pandemic. In addition, no conflicts of interest by civil servants or ministers were identified in the contracts managed by the Scottish Government relevant to the scope of Module 5. Audit Scotland carried out an assessment of the arrangements in place at the Scottish Government to prevent fraud and corruption. Audit Scotland concluded that the Scottish Government had applied the appropriate controls regarding new or extended COVID-19 procurement contracts. Looking now at the generation and processing of supply offers. From early in the pandemic, many offers were received from potential suppliers in relation to PPE. Initially, offers were received via a dedicated mailbox, and they were then triaged. Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Development International carried out significant due diligence checks, such as visiting factories, including those based in China and in the Far East. In about mid-April of 2020, an online supplier offer portal was created by NSS to automate and streamline the triage process. Thereafter, NSS applied its established procedures. Approximately 2,700 offers were received, although only one progressed to securing a contract from NSS. As Mr. Walt pointed out this morning, there was no comparable system to the VIP or high priority lane in Scotland. As far as the Scottish Government is aware, no individual or company received preferential treatment in procurement or the award of contracts. Turning to emergency trade and strategy, at the start of the pandemic, a key issue was that items were either not produced in Scotland or at the scale needed. A strategy was developed that comprised two parts. Firstly, a buy strategy focused on securing supplies rapidly on the global market, and secondly, a make strategy focused on building supply capacity within Scotland's manufacturing base. A major focus was on identifying and working with Scottish manufacturers in the production of key healthcare products. The make strategy helped to establish several new domestic supply chains and support greater self-sufficiency. By April of 2021, around 88% of Scotland's PPE by value, excluding gloves, was being manufactured domestically. This was a considerable success. Looking finally at distribution and logistics, in April of 2020, the Scottish Government's PPE Directorate assisted in the coordination of a range of PPE delivery aspects, including supply to GPs, dentists, and social care providers. Prior to the pandemic, care homes procured their own PPE. However, early on in the pandemic, the Scottish Government worked with NSS to establish local PPE hubs. In due course, these hubs supported the whole social care sector with all its PPE needs, where normal supply routes had failed. The hubs also supported unpaid carers and social care personal assistants. In mid-April of 2020, the Scottish Government announced that NSS would provide a one-off top-up of supplies to all care homes. From 1st April 2020, frontline staff could raise any issues with the quantity or quality of PPE via a dedicated mailbox. At the same time, health boards established a nominated single point of contact. These individuals were people who were responsible for managing PPE supply within their health boards, and they were in place to resolve issues with supply concerns. Further, between April and August of 2020, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, Ms Freeman, received daily and weekly reports on the status of PPE and its distribution. Notwithstanding Scotland's geography and higher proportion of remote settlements, NSS never reached a point where distribution became entirely overstretched. Lady, in conclusion, there's more that I can mention, such as the work done by the Scottish Government to identify the lessons to be learned, the potential need for a mechanism to request emergency or additional funding from the UK Government over and above that generated through the Barnett formula, and on the good uses to which excess stock was put within Scotland. But time does not permit. These are important topics, and we would encourage those interested to read our written opening statement, which will be available on the inquiry website. As we hope we have shown in this opening statement, the existence of working relationships, innovative approaches, and tried and tested processes were central to the Scottish Government's approach to procurement during the pandemic. All these contributed to a system that was efficient, effective, and fair. In closing, the Scottish Government would wish to pay tribute to all its partners with whom it worked and collaborated in providing the essential supplies and equipment to keep the people of Scotland safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Mitchell. We'll break now. I shall return at 3:30. Doherty. Oh, there you are. Is it Dot or Doherty? Doherty. No. Well, I can hear you, but you're not on the microphone.
That's it now.
That's it.
Milady, I appear on behalf of NHS National Services Scotland, or NSS for short. A written opening statement for NSS has been provided to the inquiry, but I will not repeat that whole statement today. Instead, I would like to take the opportunity to focus on three matters. First, NSS's national procurement systems, distinct from the other three nations in the UK. Second, national procurement's cooperation with the other three nations in the UK. And third, levels of PPP in Scotland during the pandemic. So the first point, Lady, national procurement systems distinct from the other three nations in the UK. NSS provides national strategic support services and expert advice to Scotland's NHS. For the purposes of this module, the services provided by NSS's National Procurement Directorate, National Procurement for short, are particularly relevant. Consistent with healthcare in Scotland being distinct from the rest of the UK, the systems operated by National Procurement for obtaining healthcare-related equipment and supplies for NHS Scotland are also distinct from those elsewhere in the UK. NSS is accountable to the Scottish Government for procurement and distribution of healthcare-required equipment and supplies to NHS Scotland boards by National Procurement. So there's a Scottish NSS, a Scottish Procurement Unit, which provides a central procurement and distribution service to the Scottish NHS, and a Scottish Government with overall responsibility. And I stress the self-standing nature of the Scottish position. Prior to the pandemic, National Procurement had in place an established and experienced procurement team, which worked closely with procurement colleagues across the Scottish Health Boards. It had established networks across the NHS in Scotland and with key suppliers of healthcare equipment and supplies. When the NHS in Scotland was placed into emergency measures at the start of the pandemic, the Scottish Government established a dedicated PPE team. As a delivery partner of the Scottish Government, National Procurement purchased, stored and distributed PPE stock during the pandemic. Its established procurement team and pre-existing networks proved to be of great benefit in these tasks. Relying on its existing systems and knowledge, it was able to procure high volumes of PPE and other key equipment. Prices were volatile, which meant National Procurement had to purchase in a complex and uncertain market. It was able, however, to obtain most products at prices commensurate with the prevailing market conditions, as noted by Audit Scotland in its COVID-19 PPE report. National Procurement relied on its existing trusted suppliers where possible. A supply offers portal was set up to receive and manage the surge in offers to supply products. Contracts with new suppliers were subject to the Scottish Government's requirement for supplier validation prior to offers being approved for purchase. It's important to note, as has already been said by others today, that the High Priority Lane, or VIP lane, established by the UK Government did not exist in Scotland, and National Procurement had no involvement in it. I observe that the inquiry's expert, Professor Sanjay Grals, has noted with approval in his report that Scotland and the other devolved nations were able to continue with limited adaptations with their existing organisational arrangements and processes for healthcare procurement, which facilitated oversight. And he contrasts the position in England, where a new set of arrangements was introduced. My second point, Milady, relates to National Procurement's cooperation with the other three nations of the UK. National Procurement collaborated with the four nations PPE working groups to support mutual aid and to ensure that there was no detrimental effect to supplies to the other UK nations from its procurement for Scotland. My third point, Milady, relates to levels of PPE in Scotland during the pandemic. At no point during the pandemic did National Procurement's stockpile of PPE for NHS Scotland run out. Throughout this period, incoming stock arrived at the Central National Distribution Warehouse and was distributed. The fact that the national stockpile did not ever run out was confirmed by Audit Scotland in its COVID-19 PPE report. To aid oversight of stock levels at a local NHS level, NSS introduced a daily stock count in hospitals and later introduced a national inventory management system across NHS Scotland health boards to support pandemic stock availability and management. Also of note is that from March 2020, National Procurement's role to support NHS Scotland health boards was expanded to include supporting Scotland's primary healthcare and social care sectors. In conclusion, my lady, National Procurement's priority during the pandemic was to protect frontline services, staff, carers, patients and residents across health and social care. Its staff recognised that securing an immediate, high-volume supply of PPE and other key healthcare products was of critical importance in meeting that priority. National Procurement staff responded to the challenge in a professional and efficient manner, thereby supporting Scotland's response to the pandemic. Witnesses to procurement and distribution in Scotland are due to give evidence on Monday, the 24th of March. Given the distinct nature of Scotland's procurement services compared to those elsewhere in the UK, it is hoped that other witnesses who give evidence in this module make clear the geographical extent of the procurement services about which they give evidence. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Doherty. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Bryn Handa. I appear on behalf of the Welsh Government. During the pandemic, the procurement and distribution of key healthcare-related equipment and supplies in Wales was carried out by the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership, working with the Life Sciences Hub and the Surgical Materials Testing Laboratory. The NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership is an independent organisation established in 2011 to provide services on behalf of NHS bodies in Wales, including procurement. It is the central procurement body for key healthcare equipment and supplies in Wales. During the pandemic, it carried out all the operational procurement for NHS bodies, and from March 2020, it was also the operational procurement body for the social care sector and the wider NHS in Wales, including independent contractors in primary care such as GPs, dentists, pharmacies and optometrists. The types of PPE to be used in health and social care settings were specified by the UK Infection Prevention and Control Cells guidance. Within that framework, the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership was responsible for decisions about what PPE and other supplies to buy, in what quantity, from which suppliers, and at what cost. It was also responsible for contractual arrangements and provisions, the use of framework agreements and direct awards, the publishing of contract award notices, and the management of contracts once awarded. The NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership also carried out demand modelling, stock management, and distribution. The Welsh Government's practical role in procurement was limited. It provided funding, oversight, and support. It did not conduct procurement of healthcare supplies or equipment, apart from certain limited exceptions. Between March 2020 and June 2022, over 1.4 billion items of PPE were issued in Wales. Of these, over 500 million were issued to the social care sector. At no point did Wales run out of PPE at a national level. As my lady is aware, procurement processes in Wales were different from those in England. In Wales, there was a strong centralised NHS procurement system in place before the pandemic, and there were no high priority or VIP lanes at any time. All offers to supply PPE or other key healthcare equipment and supplies in Wales were subject to the same transparent and rigorous processes. As a result, Wales did not encounter the problems that were experienced in England. No reports were required to be made to the Welsh Government's head of counter-fraud in respect of PPE or other healthcare procurement during the pandemic, nor were any reports required to be made in respect of conflicts of interest, preferential treatment, or suspected or attempted fraudulent attempts to secure contracts. The Welsh Government had no cause to report suspected PPE fraud to the police or to the Crown Prosecution Service. Wales also did not experience the same level of unusable or expired stock having to be written off or destroyed as in England. In the 2-year period ending in April 2022, NHS Wales expenditure on PPE was some £385 million, of which just over 3% was written off as unusable due to shelf life expiry. Although, of course, any amount of waste is regrettable and must be minimised, a figure of 3% represents a modest margin of error in light of the fast-paced changes of the pandemic and the overriding need to ensure that stocks of sufficient PPE were available. Wales was also able to donate some excess stocks to other countries during the pandemic. As noted earlier, the Welsh Government's practical role in respect of the procurement and distribution of key healthcare equipment and supplies during the pandemic was principally to facilitate and to provide funding, oversight and support. It also enabled some procurement through existing framework agreements and engaged with industry to stimulate the domestic supply of key products. As to funding, between 2020 and 2022, Wales received £1.022 billion in consequential funding from the UK Government for PPE. In the 2-year period ending April 2022, NHS Wales expenditure on PPE totalled approximately £385 million. The Cardiff University Wales Governance Centre estimated that the cost of PPE and the devolved element of the test and trace system in Wales cost approximately half the level of consequential funding stemming from English spending on test and trace and PPE, representing a £158 lower cost per person in Wales than in England. As is set out in detail in the Welsh Government's evidence, funding for the procurement and distribution of healthcare equipment and supplies was subject to scrutiny by ministers via the Star Chamber. Starting in April 2020, ministerial PPE meetings also provided a forum to raise and resolve any emerging issues at a ministerial level, and an opportunity to review details of the current and future stock position and the forward order pipeline. Procurement was also subject to oversight by the COVID-19 Health Countermeasures Group, and later the PPE Sourcing and Distribution Group. In addition to funding and monitoring PPE stock supplies, the Welsh Government recognised the need to act quickly to secure the domestic supply of key products, which global markets would be unable to provide reliably. In March 2020, the Welsh Government established the Critical Equipment Requirement Engineering Team, known by the acronym CERET, which was made up of key individuals with specialist expertise in health, finance, procurement and innovation, from both within and outside government. CERET supported the development and manufacture of new products and secured components, raw materials and services to help meet the needs of Wales during the early phases of the pandemic. This included supporting Welsh manufacturers to change their existing production lines, to manufacture PPE and explore new methods of production that aim to offer public bodies a strong local supply chain. CERET did not carry out any procurement of healthcare-related supplies, apart from a single instance in respect of components for continuous positive airway pressure devices and materials to enable volunteers to make scrubs. Together, this amounted to a spend of less than £650,000, and these were the only healthcare equipment or supplies directly procured by any part of Welsh Government for the health or social care sectors during the pandemic. My Lady, the Welsh Government is very aware that an important, if not the predominant, public concern will be whether there were sufficient supplies of PPE available to those working in the health and social care sectors. In Wales, it was realised early in the pandemic that the stock of PPE was diminishing very rapidly. Although the pandemic influenza stockpile worked as an effective buffer, some items were inadequate and stocks were exhausted much quicker than expected, meaning that Wales needed to procure more PPE than initially anticipated to meet demand. That was a difficult task because most supplies came from China and India, and due to an increased global demand for such supplies and lockdown restrictions in those countries, they were difficult to obtain. In response, the Welsh Government adopted a multi-pronged approach. It supported the procurement of additional PPE supplies. It worked with other UK nations to pool procurement efforts and provide mutual aid. And it continued international supplies and increased collaboration with Welsh businesses to produce PPE domestically. At no time did Wales run out of PPE. That said, even where there was sufficient PPE stock, there were distribution challenges. As the inquiry heard in Module 3, there were instances of healthcare workers in Wales who were unable to obtain PPE or were so concerned about the availability of PPE that they were forced to adopt unsafe infection and prevention control practices. Although the Welsh Government addressed the question of supply at a national level, the inquiry heard evidence during Module 3, which the Welsh Government accepts, that delivering PPE stock to local health boards did not necessarily mean it reached the right hospital or the right ward. As the inquiry knows, the Welsh Government is not responsible for the operational delivery of social care, nor does it directly fund the delivery of social services or social care. That is the legal responsibility of local authorities in Wales. Ordinarily, PPE for the social care sector was sourced by each local authority for its local area, and private providers were responsible for sourcing their own. However, early in the pandemic, local authorities were experiencing difficulties in providing sufficient amounts of PPE to the sector because global supply chains were collapsing and PPE was in very high demand. Following Welsh Government discussions with the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership and local authority leaders, the Minister for Health and Social Services announced on the 19th of March 2020 that the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership's procurement and distribution remit would expand to include the social care sector. This allowed more effective central procurement by the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership than would have been possible by individual local authorities. PPE to manage COVID-19 was provided for free to the social care sector in Wales during the pandemic. It was also provided for free to independent NHS contractors in primary care, such as GPs, dentists, pharmacies, and optometrists. In conclusion, my lady, as in all other modules, the Welsh Government will do all that it can to help and support the inquiry's investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Byrne. Ms Moynihan. There you are.
I appear on behalf of the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, which I'll refer to in the course of this submission as the Department. My lady, the Department would like to again take the opportunity to offer its sincere condolences to those who have been bereaved because of COVID-19. It extends its sympathy to the wider public who suffered during the pandemic, both in terms of the virus and also of the impact of the many measures that have been taken to combat that virus. My lady, the Department recognises the effects of COVID-19 are ongoing and that the impact of the virus is still being felt by many individuals, as well as the wider health and social care system. Like in previous modules, the bravery, commitment and professionalism of health and social care workers across Northern Ireland must be praised. In this submission, my lady, the Department would also like to thank the staff of the Business Services Organisation, which has been referred to today as BSO, who worked behind the scenes in exploring potential new procurement routes for medical equipment and the supply of personal protective equipment. This was at a time when the global supply chain was experiencing extreme pressure. The Department wishes also to thank those who assisted in the distribution of that vital equipment. The COVID-19 pandemic presented unprecedented challenges to the public health systems worldwide, and it is important to acknowledge that the work carried out by these staff members was integral to protecting frontline workers and the wider population. Now, my lady, the Department's role in procurement is somewhat limited in comparison to these areas examined by the module in other modules to this inquiry. However, by this statement, we wish to outline the role that the Department did play in the decisive actions and decisions that were taken in respect of procurement of medical equipment, PPE and other critical supplies. We will also address the second facet of this module, namely that of the distribution of equipment and supplies. My lady, as we have said before, Northern Ireland in this regard faced unique geographical and logistical challenges, and efforts were made to ensure a coordinated approach, an approach that prioritised the safety of healthcare workers, patients and the public. In its corporate statement, which has been provided already to the inquiry, the Department has explained how medical equipment is generally procured in Northern Ireland, and the Department believes that an understanding of the outline of the procurement process will be key to this module, and I'll set that out very briefly. In Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Public Procurement Policy was agreed by the Northern Ireland Executive in 2002. That policy requires all departments, and not just the Department of Health, but all departments, agencies, non-departmental public bodies and public corporations to carry out all procurement activities by way of a documented service level agreement. And that is carried out with the Central Procurement Directorate in the Department of Finance or a relevant Centre of Procurement Expertise. My lady, you'll have heard of those Centre of Procurement Expertise, or COPEs, as they've been referred to this morning. And these are centres of excellence with specialist procurement expertise across the Northern Ireland public sector, and they undertake procurement activities in relevant sectors. although the department uses 3 COPs generally, the most relevant of which for this module is the BSO PALS procurement, which looks to the procurement of healthcare equipment and supplies. So throughout the pandemic, BSO PALS maintained its direct operational responsibility for the procurement of key healthcare equipment and supplies for Northern Ireland's health and social care system. The procurement role, therefore, of the department is one of overall responsibility and legal competence for the procurement of goods and services that fall within its remit. As we've seen in earlier modules to this inquiry, the department is the lead government department for responding to the health consequences of emergencies, be they from chemical, biological, radiological or nuclear incidents, disruptions to the medical supply chain, human infectious diseases, mass casualties. This department also leads on the civil contingency arrangements for storage, management and distribution in Northern Ireland, including the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Programme, or PIPP, and I'll return to that shortly. As I've highlighted, my lady, at the start of this statement, Northern Ireland faced logistical and geographical challenges at a time when the global supply chain was under extreme pressure. Despite these pressures, BSO PALS worked to expand capacity and to meet demand and played an important role in Northern Ireland's pandemic response. In working to scale its capacity to meet demand, it is the overall view of the department that BSO PALS performed well, particularly considering the difficulties that they faced. The department assisted BSO PALS in securing ministerial approval for establishing a dynamic purchasing system for PPE. This dynamic purchasing system, or which we have referred to as the DPS, effectively allowed BSO PALS to access a pool of essentially pre-approved suppliers. This thereby enabled access to supply routes more quickly. The establishment of the DPS was in recognition of the significant increase in demand which had been encountered in the first wave, and was considered an opportunity to mitigate supply chain issues such as the rapidly changing supply and demand position. So, my lady, the department, in conjunction with the Northern Ireland Executive, explored many channels, both locally and internationally, in an attempt to procure PPE for Northern Ireland. And in respect of this, officials in the department, BSO and the Department of Finance worked in collaboration with officials from the Executive Office, and in this collaboration, they were able to purchase significant stock on behalf of Northern Ireland directly from China. That became colloquially known as the China contract. This contract was with a company that had been identified by the Northern Ireland Bureau in China and Invest NI, and had been approved by the Chinese government to export PPE. Conscious of the need to ensure value for money, several pieces of work were undertaken, and they included a due diligence report for the Department of Finance, an assessment of value for money that was carried out by BSO, and validation of the products by experts in infection and control from the Medicines Optimisation and Innovation Centre. So while this Chinese contract was led by BSO PALS and the Department of Finance's CFP Supplies and Services Division, the contract was effectively a cross-departmental arrangement and was signed by the department's previous minister, the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, all on behalf of the Northern Ireland Executive. My lady, if I could now turn to the second limb of this module, being the distribution of medical equipment. The emergency planning branch in the department managed the stockpile of pandemic influenza preparedness programme both before and during the pandemic. BSO was responsible for requesting the release of that PIPP stock at the start of the pandemic, which the Chief Medical Officer approved. The department established a PPE strategic cell on the 23rd of March 2020, and the aim of that cell was to prioritise the supply and distribution of PPE for the HSE and to monitor the distribution of PPE from trusts into the independent sector. The cell also oversaw the introduction of a revised process for health and social care trusts to order personal protection equipment on the high demand management list. My lady, this revised process was aimed to ensure a more even distribution of stock across all health and social care sites, and for trusts to be able to maintain local stock levels higher than what would normally be expected. In addition to this, there was an oxygen supply working group which was established, and that worked with the health and social care trusts and the existing regional oxygen supplier, BOC, and their aim was to coordinate and authorise a prioritised work plan to enhance trusts' infrastructure and capacity for oxygen supplies at that time. Thereafter, with the development of lateral flow tests, the Health Minister approved the establishment of a Northern Ireland SMART meaning systemic, meaningful, asymptomatic and repeated testing, a SMART programme board, and that was done in the department in March 2021. The board had advice and had fulfilled an advice and administrative role in relation to some aspects of distribution and worked very closely with DHSC, UKHSA, BSO and a range of other local delivery partners to assist at times coordinating the distribution of those lateral flow tests to sites across Northern Ireland. Therefore, my lady, to conclude, we'd like to say yet again that we welcome the opportunity to provide this opening statement. We hope that our input into this module and this overview, which summarises the role of the department, will be useful in setting the scene. We also wish to reiterate our thanks to the health and social care workers and officials in BSO, departmental officials, all of whom have been instrumental in the fight against COVID-19. And we welcome this module of the inquiry, hope to learn lessons from this and consider what things could have been done better and to learn from those who did differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Monaghan. Stober, I think you're wearing two different but related hats.
Yes, thank you, my lady. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I represent the interest of both the Local Government Association and the Welsh Local Government Association. I shall first start with the submissions of the Local Government Association, but I'd like to say on behalf of both associations, extend their condolences to all of those who suffered the terrible effects of the pandemic, those who lost lives of families, and those who continue to suffer the effects of the pandemic. The inquiry will know that the Local Government Association, having all but 2 local authorities as members, is the voice of local government. This opening statement for Module 5 seeks to highlight key points from the witness statement of the Chief Executive, Joanna Killian. It aims in particular to highlight the lessons that must be learned in order to enable local government to deal with the procurement in the context of any future pandemic with the greatest resilience and preparedness. Ms. Killian's statement emphasises that future national planning processes must involve local authorities along with those organisations and bodies such as care provider organisations delivering the services that require PPE. This proposition should be uncontentious, but her statement makes clear why it is so important. The fact is that the pandemic started in early 2020. Local government had not been adequately engaged in the planning process, such as sickness. There were found to be inadequate supplies of PPE. The adult social care sector, in particular, was adversely affected because of this shortage, both when supplies were redirected to the NHS or distribution networks were suboptimal. When the pandemic started in early 2020, the mismatch between the preparation that had been made and the actual need for PPE was soon very evident. The greatest challenges with PPE procurement concerned the shortage of suitable PPE for those that needed it, the difficulty in procuring it given the surge in global demand, and the lack of clear and accurate guidance about what type of PPE could be used, in which settings, such as mortuaries, children's residential care homes, and special schools, and for which client groups. The responsibilities, including producing plans of councils in civil and health emergencies, had already been set out in paragraphs 26 to 40 and paragraphs 90 to 164 in the witness statement the LGA provided in Module 1, JK/13 INQ 177803. The issues of the shortage of suitable PPE and the difficulties in procuring had been considered in previous preparedness exercises, but they had proceeded on the wrong basis, as the inquiry has already noted. It was therefore entirely predictable that when the pandemic started, councils and the wider care provider were very worried about the increased demand and associated cost of sourcing and providing PPE during the pandemic, a cost that the adult social care sector had previously not had to consider and was not prepared for. Councils and the wider care sector also struggled with changes in instructions and guidance on PPE use, which exposed staff, patients, clients, and service users to risks. Of course, it did not fall to the LGA to remedy these defaults. Its primary role was to ensure that government knew about the stresses and strains at the level of local government, and conversely, local governments were aware of the steps taken by central government, including the changes of procedures, such as the responsibility for procuring PPE and then holding and distributing stocks. This role is fully explained in Ms. Killian's statement and does not need to be repeated in this opening. What can be emphasised is that through this role, the LGA was in a very strong position to see the problems and articulate them. Above all else, the LGA sought to improve understanding the practicalities of finding, holding, and distributing PPE was absolutely essential. That was an issue of crisis management of the greatest importance. Ms. Killian has put it in this way. Due to the combination of government planning and PPE stockpiling, based on the assumption of an influenza pandemic, reliance on a just-in-time approach to the delivery of equipment beyond pre-existing stockpiles, a lack of planning in the UK to be able to put in place alternative production plans to respond to the global shortage of PPE. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit the UK began from a place of significant disadvantage, with insufficient PPE resources to supply the NHS, social care sector, and frontline workers, and inadequate mechanisms to rectify this. It is obvious that if these were to recur in the future, no lessons would have been learned from the inquiry. That is why she has emphasised that the UK national planning needs to consider the following: which setting and workers will require access to PPE, what sort of PPE they will need, how much PPE will be needed as a result, and the relevant specification for that PPE. 2, where that PPE is sought from at a time when global demand for PPE will peak and supply chains will be disrupted, whether that is through stockpiles, the ability to make a step change in domestic production in a matter of weeks or a combination of both. Thirdly, the distribution processes and plans needed to ensure PPE can be delivered in a timely manner to everyone who needs it. The inquiry is asked to make these points explicitly in its report on this module. If it does, the recommendation can provide a firm foundation for building England's resilience and preparedness. If this does not occur, the same problems she has noted will recur. That simply cannot be allowed to happen. My lady, I now turn to the submissions of Local Government Association. Again, as the inquiry will know, the Welsh Local Government Association represents the voice of local government in Wales. All 22 local authorities are members of WLGA. This opening statement seeks to highlight key points from the witness statement of the Chief Executive, Dr. Chris Llewellyn. His statement sets out much detail of the many meetings that took place within Wales at both the political and officer level. It is not necessary in this opening to detail these, that the inquiry has the exhibits that relate to them. There's much that went well in Wales in terms of discussions about procurement. Thus, Wales benefited greatly from the work of the National Procurement Network, which brought together the heads of procurement from each of the 22 Welsh authorities and was specifically concerned with the issues which this module will discuss in relation to Wales. This network, at the material time, the All Wales Forum to support local procurement collaboration and knowledge sharing. It worked then, as it does now, to coordinate collaborative procurement activity and knowledge sharing across local government in Wales and with the wider public sector, including the Welsh Government. And the work of procurement as it related to adult social care was supported by the National Commissioning Board. Accordingly, within Wales, there was a sound basis for coordination of efforts to make sure that procurement worked well. The issues of concerns lay elsewhere. As the inquiry will already know from modules 1 and 2, in the years before the pandemic, the work on resilience and preparation was inadequate. Dr. Llewellyn has put the point in this way. To the knowledge of WLGA, there have been no specific preparation exercises for the procurement sector, nor have procurement officials been involved within the range of national and local exercises undertaken. All local authorities in Wales are required to undertake emergency planning, with a pandemic being one of the many emergencies that are planned for. Much of the planning is undertaken in cross-public sector partnership and will include plans for care homes and the wider care sector. Medical provision is a responsibility of the NHS in Wales, and pandemic stocks for emergency supplies of medical equipment and supplies are procured, stored, and distributed by NHS. Reflecting on the experiences of COVID-19 pandemic and the importance of securing supplies of PPE for Wales, WLGA would expect to see the procurement sector included within any future exercises. Inevitably, without national preparatory exercises in Wales, there was a significant tension between the work of the government to support the NHS in Wales and an equivalent urgency being given to the needs of local government. Moreover, guidance on the way to approach these needs was missing or inadequate and did not initially help to resolve the tension. Local authorities were therefore left to their own devices to ensure adequate procurement, placing their own orders and chasing their leads. Dr. Llewellyn points out that this also led to problems of a very specific kind, because non-compliant stock was sometimes supplied and price gouging occurred. Individual councils therefore had to be alert to risks involved in their own procurement decisions, balancing cost and size of order in the context of rising demand and prices. And of course, it left councils open to exploitation and at risk of receiving poor quality stock. In the context of a worldwide pandemic, this was very far from an optimal approach, setting England and Wales in conflict, though fortunately, and very much to their credit, there was a spirit of cooperation between Welsh authorities. Dr. Llewellyn notes the analysis of Professor James Downs of Cardiff Business School. There is no doubt that a nationally coordinated collective response would have helped mitigate the problems of supply and price of PPE. The initial phrase of Council working independently to procure PPE continued far too long before cross-sector collaboration was put in place. It is argued that it was only when NHS supplies were stabilised that the Welsh Government's attention turned to the care sector. Local authorities did their best in sharing information about suppliers and did not seem to abuse the system by procuring more than their fair share. Rather than there being competition between councils, the ethos was one of working together and sharing intelligence. There were also examples of cross-border working, as masks were received in Wales from Scotland in April 2020, and Wales sent a consignment of masks to the NHS England in May 2020 as part of the mutual aid scheme. Overall, more stock was provided by Wales to other countries than they received. There are lessons to be learned around supply, particularly the resilience on international supply chains and the risks involved in these chains breaking down. Welsh councils generally found that their pre-pandemic framework suppliers did not deliver. It was the off-framework suppliers who provided better pricing, availability, and were able to work smarter and deliver products. There are case studies of good practices in onshore production of PPE in Wales, including Rota Medical, which has provided Welsh-made face coverings at scale for pupils in Welsh schools. Dr. Llewellyn concludes, in the eventuality of a future pandemic, the WLGA considers it imperative that these working arrangements be reached in a much shorter time frame, minimizing the risks borne by individual local authorities and their procurement expertise, and reducing potential harm faced by those providing and receipt of care. The inquiry is therefore asked to recommend that in the preparation for another pandemic, WLGA is closely involved. Welsh government ensures that local government is not required to manage risks on a piecemeal basis. And finally, that there is a parity of preparation for the needs of both the NHS and local government. Thank you, my lady. We continue to assist in this inquiry.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Stober. Ms. Hannaford.
Thank you, my lady. This is the opening statement on behalf of the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office, including number 10, remains committed to assisting the inquiry's investigations across all modules. It continues to provide assistance to both ministers from the previous administration and to current and former civil servants, so as to ensure that the inquiry is provided with the best evidence available. The Cabinet Office has provided extensive material to assist the inquiry's investigations in this module. This has included 3 detailed written corporate witness statements from Gareth Rhys-Williams, then the Government Chief Commercial Officer, Claire Gibbs, currently the Joint Interim Government Chief Commercial Officer, and Mark Cheeseman, Chief Executive of the Public Sector Fraud Authority. These statements are supplemented by significant disclosure and support for a number of individual witnesses. The Cabinet Office recognises that there has been significant public interest in procurement during the pandemic, including allegations of fraud and cronyism. It takes these allegations seriously and is keen to receive the inquiry's findings. The Government is committed to introducing a duty of candour on public authorities to improve transparency and accountability, and has appointed a COVID counter-fraud commissioner. We encourage the inquiry to consider the changes the Government is already making when formulating its recommendations. The scale of the challenge posed by the pandemic was unique in peacetime. This included the need for the Government to source significant volumes of key goods and services with extreme urgency in an environment of considerable international market disruption and competition. For example, up to 20 times the normal volume of PPE was needed. Commercial professionals bought essential equipment for frontline health and social care workers and enabled a national testing network to be set up from scratch. Staff sought to secure deals for scarce PPE in order to allow the NHS to continue to function. There were pressures on them to reassure ministers, the press and the broader public that the system was working and that they were moving with speed. The work undertaken by Cabinet Office staff was wide in scope, carried out at great pace, in improvised and usually virtual teams, and facing unprecedented market conditions. This activity supported our ability to combat the virus, supported the NHS, and ultimately helped protect the public. Ministers and officials from the Cabinet Office had key roles in forming and executing procurement during the pandemic. First, Cabinet Office ministers, including the Prime Minister, with support from officials, provided a strategic response. Second, the Cabinet Office provided the public sector with prompt guidance on policy applicable in emergency procurement. Third, the Cabinet Office directly led one element of procurement activity, the ventilator challenge. And fourth, Cabinet Office commercial staff were redeployed from their normal role to support DHSC and the NHS on other key procurement activities of interest to this inquiry, including PPE and testing. Public sector procurement is required to be carried out in accordance with the Public Contract Regulations 2015. It was apparent at the outset of the pandemic that the time needed to execute competitive procurement procedures under the regulations in many cases would not enable the government to procure items or services at the pace required. For example, a competitive dialogue procedure typically takes months to complete. The Cabinet Office issued a procurement policy note in March 2020 explaining the options available to procure correctly at the necessary speed. These included the use of accelerated procedures, the use of existing frameworks, and the use of the flexible emergency procurement procedure provided by Regulation 32, which allows direct awards of contracts for cases of extreme urgency brought about by unforeseeable events, where the usual time limits cannot be complied with. Exactly the situation the UK found itself in when competing with other countries to obtain globally scarce PPE. It was frequently necessary to rely on Regulation 32, particularly when time was limited, because the small amount of available stock would otherwise be sold to competing countries. As to the operational response, firstly, ventilators. The Cabinet Office led the Ventilator Challenge, an initiative to design and build new ventilators in the UK. Immediately prior to the pandemic, there were no intensive care ventilators made in the UK. In March 2020, DHSC anticipated that up to 90,000 patients might need them, while the NHS had stocks of around 7,000. A number of companies with experience of developing medical technology were tasked by the Cabinet Office with designing a simple mechanical ventilator that could be made in the UK. These design companies were paired with manufacturing partners who could rapidly scale up production. By the end of March 2020, the first manufacturing contracts were signed, and in April, a new production line was being commissioned at a factory in Sweden. The initiative delivered 15,000 ventilators within 4 months, compared to the 3 to 7 years typically taken to design and approve new products. Second, PPE. In March 2020, it became clear that the amount of PPE likely to be needed by the health and social care sector would rapidly exhaust the pre-pandemic stock holding and the supply chains of the suppliers who had been used before the pandemic. These suppliers struggled to fulfil existing orders and could not respond to the sudden and enormous leap in demand. In addition, the existing systems and structures of the principal buying organisation, SCCL, were not designed to cope with the many new suppliers. DHSC set up a parallel supply chain to radically increase capacity. A Cabinet Office team was deployed to set up the buying arm of the parallel supply chain, the PPE buy cell, on around the 21st of March 2020. This team quickly grew to almost 800 people, including over 50 from the Cabinet Office. More than 18 billion items of PPE were ordered in 15 weeks of operation. The UK buy stream, one of the 4 buying streams in the parallel supply chain, received thousands of offers from suppliers all over the world. These potential suppliers were instructed to fill in a web form. The number of offers quickly exceeded the capacity of the PPE buy cell to process them. Some 3,000 by the 7th of April 2020 and 25,000 over the 15-week period of the buy cell. Many such suppliers, some frustrated by what they saw as delays in processing their offers, appealed to their MPs, to ministers and to the DHSC and NHS officials directly, and this resulted in requests for follow-up. Those MPs and senior officials often in turn contacted the buy-sell to find out what had happened to the offer. Referrers wanted to know that good offers were being picked up and processed. The pressure of responding to these requests took up significant resources within the buy-sell. These two routes, direct email and the web form, were in place at the beginning of April. The direct email route became what is now known as the high priority lane, which in addition to checking opportunities, worked as a handling team to respond to the requests and to absorb the pressure. There has been a significant amount of criticism of the high priority lane and suggestions made that it was a method for ministers' associates to obtain contracts improperly. This is dealt with in the Cabinet Office's corporate witness statements. Cabinet Office acknowledges that the judgment in the PestFix judicial review proceedings considered the question of whether there had been unequal treatment by use of the high priority lane. The judgment stated that the use of the high priority lane breached equal treatment rules, although also stated that the specific offers considered in the judicial review, that's from PestFix and IANDA, would have very likely resulted in the award of contracts, whether on the high priority lane or not, based on the merits of the offers. It will obviously be for the inquiry to reach its own conclusions on the evidence of the different witnesses. The Cabinet Office at this point notes the following key points. Firstly, the high priority and non-high priority lane were both methods of entry into the buy-sell. They constituted only the first stage, an initial check or opportunity stage. If considered worthwhile, offers were passed through technical assurance and subsequent processes and then approval. These stages were independent of the high priority lane and applied to both high priority lane and non-high priority lane opportunities. Second, a range of people referred offers to the high priority lane, including parliamentarians from the majority party at the time, as well as other parties, doctors, uni officials, and health service managers. And thirdly, those cases on the high priority lane which obtained contracts did so because they passed technical assurance and were selling required goods for an appropriate price. Almost 90% of suppliers referred through the high priority lane were unsuccessful. And whilst proportionately more offers on the high priority lane received contracts than those on the non-high priority lane, many of the offers on the non-high priority stream were of poor quality. Thirdly, testing. In March 2020, the effective capacity to perform COVID-19 tests in the UK was estimated at 3,000 per day. The Secretary of State for Health and Social Care set a goal to be able to perform 100,000 tests by the end of April 2020. A Cabinet Office team supported DHSE in buying equipment, consumables and services to achieve this goal and provided commercial leadership for the NHS Test and Trace organisation until August 2020. Expert evidence. The inquiry has commissioned its own experts to provide their views on both procurement during the pandemic and wider supply chain landscape. Although we've expressed some concerns about Professor Sanchez-Grail's report, we have welcomed the opportunity to provide comments on the draft reports and encourage the inquiry to consider these comments in detail alongside the evidence. 3 key points in relation to lessons that can be learned.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to bring it to a close.
My lady, yes. 3 key points in relation to lessons learned. The Cabinet Office faced a number of difficulties, including data collection, lack of stockpile, and the challenging number of offers to the buy-sell. The appropriate solution, therefore, for the future requires careful weighing up. Secondly, procurement regulation. As a result of learnings from emergency procurement, changes were incorporated into the Procurement Act 2023 to equip the government to respond to future large-scale emergencies effectively. And then, thirdly, tackling fraud. The pandemic prompted efforts to strengthen the government's response to public sector fraud, including the PSFA launched in August 2022. In December 2024, the government appointed a counter-fraud commissioner. And finally, the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill intends to safeguard public money by reducing public sector fraud, error and debt. So in conclusion, the nature and scale of the challenge was unprecedented in peacetime for procurement. Responding to this challenge required a sustained effort by commercial staff to support the NHS. The Cabinet Office welcomes the opportunity to contribute evidence to this module and is keen to learn lessons that will enable an effective commercial response to any future such emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hannaford. Last but definitely not least, Mr Delvey.
Thank you, my lady. I appear on behalf of the United Kingdom Health Security Agency, or UKHSA, as I will refer to the agency. In this module about procurement, the inquiry has asked us to assist on the procurement of COVID-19 polymerase chain reaction tests, referred to as PCR tests, those that have to go to a lab for processing, and lateral flow tests, including, in particular, lateral flow antigen tests, LFD tests, which through their wide use during the pandemic, we will all be familiar with. Some of us may have a box or two at home. An issue that my lady will be considering in this module is whether the adequate balance was achieved between speed, quality, and cost. That is an important question, but it is one that must be viewed in light of the circumstances at the time, which are, such as your ladyship has heard, the need to buy in high volumes, at speed, in the face of global competition, across disrupted supply chains, and in the context of an ever-changing new virus. That context, when considering this question, includes the unique challenges experienced in the procurement of tests. That tests had to be integrated into complex distribution and digital systems. That the way testing would be used was subject to continuous debate and changing policies. But most critically, that at the outset of the pandemic, a COVID-19 test did not exist. Tests had to be designed, developed, validated, authorised before they could be commercially rolled out. And so in this extraordinary emergency, if the quality of a test must meet a minimum efficiency requirement, and if the loss of speed risks greater losses in humans and economic terms, how should costs be regarded in the balancing exercise? As UKHSA has said before, in lessons to be learned now, we must acknowledge that risk appetites change. After the emergency, the question is what systems need to be developed for a better response in the future that can achieve an adequate balance between speed, quality, and cost, regardless of the infection or pathogen. UKHSA in October 2021 brought together the health protection elements of Public Health England, PHE, and NHS Test and Trace. In January 2020, PHE worked at exceptional speed with international collaborators to succeed in developing a COVID-19 PCR assay that went on to underpin commercial COVID-19 PCR tests globally. Additionally, PHE evaluated a variety of proposed COVID-19 tests, including, starting in late summer 2020, 90 different types of LFD tests in 5 months. NHS Test and Trace was established on the 28th of May 2020 to lead an at-scale testing and tracing service, which included making testing available at speed to meet the government's announced testing targets. From September 2020, NHS Test and Trace established a dedicated commercial function to undertake the work to get tests to the public. Being able to identify whether somebody is infectious is critical because it allows for better use of mitigation measures, particularly when there is no established vaccine or known treatment. Identifying the infected and infectious cases by the use of PCR tests in the NHS workforce was aimed not only at maintaining the health of those workers themselves, but also facilitating the continuing availability of NHS key workers to support the early response in 2020.
It's estimated that between June 2020 and April 2021, test, trace and isolate strategies prevented 1.2 to 2 million infections. And part of that capability came from the rising availability of LFD tests, which then paved the way to reduce restrictions until the rollout of effective vaccines. Getting to that point needed the confidence to consider and progress novel technologies to evaluation, accepting that not every option may yield success. As with vaccines, the human and financial costs of the pandemic framed a political risk appetite to make significant investments in testing technologies. But if the next pandemic were to involve a different pathogen with different characteristics to COVID-19, the political, commercial and operational responses may be different. Science may offer different types of testing. So if that future pandemic requires a very different type of test, how does one identify that test more quickly and so that robust and commercial and operational processes can be established with parallel speed? It's important to acknowledge that any preparatory work is understandably framed by funding priorities. The cost of an always-on, always-ready system is unlikely to represent value for money for the public. UKHSA is building systems that are pathogen agnostic and scalable so that it can use those systems and its knowledge to respond to a new emerging infection. Similarly, UKHSA invites the inquiry to consider recommendations that are pathogen agnostic, taking into account the benefits that the Procurement Act may be able to offer. You and your team, as well as the core participants, will have our written submissions, and I do not propose to read them out. Rather, given the importance rightly placed on lessons learnt and noting the time, I want to highlight 3 key themes which have particular resonance for the future. Firstly, a need to foster partnerships. Collaboration between government departments, 4 nations, the private sector and academia were critical to the development and procurement of PCR and LFD tests. Innovative science requires collaboration and significant public and private sector funding. Accordingly, UKHSA's commercial strategy highlights as a first priority establishing a range of partnerships to benefit from different kinds of collaboration. Secondly, transparency. Transparency enhances internal confidence and oversight over contract awards. Industry confidence in UKHSA as a partner and, of course, public confidence. UKHSA prioritises transparency. The inquiry will consider the question in what circumstances might a prioritisation system assist in the procurement of key healthcare equipment and supplies in an emergency. Clearly, a system aimed at ensuring that offers of quality products are not missed when working at speed is important. But the value of such systems will be better understood when they are transparent and the routes to entry for suppliers are clear for all. Thirdly, UKHSA's commercial strategy is aimed at making it easier for businesses of all sizes and sectors to access opportunities to work with UKHSA, whether established international corporations or innovative startups, facilitating transparency in the contracting process. And thirdly, commercial capability and expertise. As I've said, the successful procurement and deployment of tests required contribution of scientists, academics and industry and, of course, many professionals in the commercial and operations teams whose efforts need to be acknowledged. The task demanded a huge workforce, one that would not be cost-effective to maintain beyond a pandemic. UKHSA's commercial work includes assuring surge and scaling capacity if a surge workforce is needed again. Planning for a surge workforce itself involves balancing the cost now against the impact on the quality of the workforce later. Finding the adequate balance will involve challenging choices for elected decision makers on the appropriate funding available. And recommendations will need to reflect that delicate exercise and be aligned across the commercial functions in government, who will again have to work together in a future pandemic for an effective pandemic procurement response. My lady, those are the submissions on behalf of UKHSA.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Delvey. Very grateful. I think that completes all the submissions. Mr Wall, you don't want to say anything further? Very well. I'd like to thank everybody, both those who made the oral submissions and the written submissions. Despite the reservations expressed by some, I feel confident that together we can investigate fully, fairly and openly the relevant issues that this module presents. And if any improvements need to be made, that I can make the necessary recommendations. So I shall return tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much. All right.